Hey everybody, welcome back to the Haunted Library 6 days until Halloween countdown. Tonight we're going to do more stories from the web. This first story is called The Face. It's retold by S.E. Schlosser, and it's from the magazine Spooky Indiana, so it's American folklore, so a little bit different. It's a ghost story. Let's see how this goes. The medical student toppled into love as soon as he set eyes on Sheila, the beautiful new transfer student. She had masses of long black hair and eyelashes so long they got tangled in her curls when she leaned over her desk. The medical student had a withdrawn nature, though not by inclination. He learned the hard way that people avoided him when they heard about his insane father, locked away in an asylum. But he had to overcome his nature or risk losing Sheila to one of the other fellows that panted after her. So the medical student volunteered to tutor her in one of her classes. After that, it was easy. Sheila toppled into love with the medical student as madly as he was in love with her. They went everywhere together, hardly bearing apart for classes. The medical student lived in a bubble of joy until the day he saw Sheila speaking to a good-looking fellow who lived in the same dorm. They were laughing together over something one of their professors had said in history class, and a shaft of sheer jealousy pierced the medical student's gut. How dare she laugh with another man? He confronted his Sheila with her perceived trespass. Offended, she stared at him. "You're crazy," she had said. He winced, reminded of his father, and shouted insults at Sheila until she stalked off in a rage. They made up over dinner, and things were fine for a while, until the medical student saw Sheila borrow a pen from a handsome blond fellow at the library. That set him off again. They hissed angry words at each other until the librarian kicked them out. The medical student huddled on the narrow bed in his dorm room until black anger gave way to common sense. He called Sheila and apologized. She accepted his apology, and they were back together. The medical student was scheduled to take Sheila to a local dance on Friday night, so he rushed back to his dorm to dress in his best. As he turned to leave, the medical student noticed that a scalpel had fallen out of his medical bag and lay haphazardly on his desk. He thrusted it carelessly inside a bag and went to pick up his girlfriend and escort her to the dance. The couple had a fabulous evening, dancing and drinking and eating. They left the party around midnight and walked hand in hand back to his dorm room for a nightcap. When they reached the entryway, Sheila veered off for a moment to ask a red-haired fellow from one of her art classes about an assignment that was due next day. The medical student was instantly filled with gut-gnawing jealousy. When Sheila rejoined him, he hustled her upstairs to his room and shouted, "You flirt with every man you meet, you tramp." "You are crazy," she shouted back. "You are stark raving mad." The boyfriend saw red. "Don't call me mad," he said, his hand groping for the loose scalpel in his medical bag on the desk. When the mists cleared from his eyes, Sheila lay dead at his feet, her throat cut from ear to ear. The whole room was covered with red gore, and her masses of black hair lay in a pool of steaming blood. The medical student's brain went into overdrive. Hide the body, clean up the blood, invent an alibi. But first, he stared at the dead girl he had loved so much. Then he knelt beside the body and slowly cut off her face. He wrapped the face carefully in plastic before putting it in the desk drawer. Then he cleaned up the blood and hid the body in a tunnel near the laundry room. The next morning, he had told his roommate that Sheila had broken up with him and gone home in a snit without finishing her classes. The roommate accepted the story without question and didn't appear to notice the way the medical student peered obsessively inside his desk drawer. The medical student finally tore himself away to attend his 11 o'clock class. When he returned at lunchtime, he found his roommate leaning out the open window looking ill. "I think I have the flu. I'd best run to the pharmacy and pick up something for it," the roommate had said when he came in. "Want me to take a look?" the medical student asked, reaching for his bag. His roommate turned white. "No," he gasped, practically running from the room. The medical student shrugged, not understanding. He peered into a drawer at Sheila's face and settled down to work on a paper that he had due next week. Downstairs, his roommate was on the phone with the police. The medical student went ballistic when the police came with a warrant to arrest him. They manhandled him out of his chair while a grim-faced officer took a look in the drawer. When he saw the dead girl's face, the officer swore violently and vomited on the floor. The medical student was placed in the asylum with his father, who was locked away in the padded room next door. Every day, while his enraged father tries to kill his attendants, the boyfriend wept and stared out the window, seeing Sheila's lovely face in the branches of a nearby tree. The face seemed to sway to the rhythm of his father's fists as his insane parent pounded and pounded at the walls. Back in the dorm, the ghost of a young girl in a blood-stained dress still floats along the hallways, searching for her face. Well, that guy sounds pretty damn insecure to me. Sounds like a past relationship of mine. Just kidding. Yeah, pretty gruesome. Cutting off her face and being extremely insecure. That's quite a winner there. Let's see if we can find another story. Story 2. This one's called The Handshake. It's from spooky North Carolina, and it's retold by S.E. Schlosser. Polly was the sweetest, prettiest girl in Goldsboro, yes sir. All the local boys were chasing her, and quite a number of the fellows from the surrounding countryside were too. All the girls were jealous of Polly because they didn't have no sweethearts to take them to the local dances. They all wanted Polly to choose her man so things could go back to normal, but Polly was picky. None of the local boys suited her, and neither did the fellows from the back country. Then one day, George Dean came home from college, and Polly was smitten. She completely dropped all of her other guys when George came courting, and it wasn't long before George proposed and Polly accepted. Polly started making preparations for the wedding and shopping for items to fill her new home. George wasn't too interested in all the wedding details. He left the woman folk to get on with that, and he started spending time down at the pool hall with some of his buddies. And that's where he met Helen, the owner's saucy daughter. She had bold black eyes and ruby red lips, and a bad girl persona that fascinated George. He spent more and more time at the pool hall and less time with Polly, who finally noticed in spite of all the hustle and bustle. Of course, she was furious. She immediately confronted him with the story, and he couldn't deny it. Suddenly, he had to toe the mark. His pool hall visits were over, and he spent every free hour he wasn't at work by her side. That didn't set well with George, but his family backed Polly up, so he went along with it. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright. The guests filled the sanctuary, and the pastor and the best man waited patiently in the chamber for the arrival of the groom. But George didn't come home. Eventually, they went searching for the missing bridegroom, and found out he left town with Helen an hour before the wedding. With dread, Polly's mother went to tell her daughter what had happened. Polly, all bright and shining and lovely in her long white dress and soft wedding veil, turned pale when her mother broke the news. Then she stiffened, grabbing her left arm as a sudden pain ripped through it. She was dead from a massive heart attack long before she hit the floor. A few days later, Polly was buried in the churchyard, still wearing her white wedding dress and veil. The whole town came to the funeral and wept at the passing of such a beautiful young girl. George and Helen, who had spent the week happily honeymooning in the Outer Banks, arrived home at the very moment that the black-clad crowd exited the churchyard. Their arrival caused a commotion. The minister had to pull Polly's father off George before he killed him, and both George and Helen's family disowned the couple right there in the street in front of everyone. The couple fled town in disgrace. Time passed, and eventually the scandal was forgotten, until the day George's father passed away. It was rumored that he was to be buried in the local churchyard just a few plots away from the girl who had almost become his daughter. Suddenly, Polly's story was revived, and folks wondered aloud if George would dare attend his father's funeral. But George was too clever for them. He waited in an inn outside of town until it was dark, and then he went to the churchyard to pay his last respects to his father. As he unburdened himself at his father's graveside, George heard a sweet female voice calling his name. "George, sweetheart." George looked up in sudden hope. Was that his mother, come to forgive him? Then he saw, rising up from a grassy mound under a spreading oak tree, a figure in a long white gown and a soft veil. Her eyes and her lips were yellow flames beneath the veil, and the rotted wedding dress glowed with a white-yellow light. It was Polly. George's body stiffened, shudders of fear coursing up and down his arms and legs. He put a shaking hand to his mouth and staggered backward, the other hand outstretched outward off the specter floating toward him. The spectral bride cackled with angry laughter and swooped forward until its hand closed over George's outstretched one in a terrible parody of a handshake. The grip of the spectral bride was so cold it burned the skin, and so hard that the bones crunched as it squeezed. "Come along into the church, George," the glowing bride whispered through the veil. George could see maggots crawling in and out of Polly's flaming eye sockets. "No," he said. "No, Polly, no." George screamed in terror, but he could not wrench his hand free. The ghost dragged him step by halting step toward the front door of the church. His hand was a red-hot agony of pain, though the rest of his body was shaken with cold. "No!" George gave a final cry of despair and wrenched again at his hand. And suddenly he was free. The ghostly bride gave a roar of rage as George ran pell-mell down the church lane and out into the street. "You're mine, George Dean. If not in this world, then in the next," the spectral bride howled after him. By the time George reached his room, the fiery pain in his hand and arm was seeping through his entire body. He ran desperately for the housemaid and begged her to send for a doctor. Then he fell into bed and stared at his hand, which was black and withered, as if it had been scorched long ago by a fire. Black and red streaks were climbing up his arms so fast he could almost see them move. George was unconscious when the doctor arrived, and the swelling was already extending to his chest and neck. There was nothing the physician could do. The injury was too severe and had spread too far. Within days, George was dead. Polly had gotten her man at last. Well, I'll tell you what. By the way, this is very rare commentary you're going to get from me after stories. Any man that does that to a woman at the altar at a wedding deserves much worse than that. So, when she dropped dead from a heart attack, I knew where this story was going, and it went right there. Let's see if we can find a third story. Okay, we got something here. It's called Seventh Barn. Now, this is an urban legend. A little bit different than the first two. I wasn't really feeling those two stories. Most of these stories on the 6-day countdown are really tailored towards young adults, even though some of them got some gore in them. There's not much sexuality or a whole lot of vulgarity, so it's more young adult type stories here. Seventh Barn, Urban Legends, author unknown. The Seventh Barn, or the Seven Barns, is a scary urban legend about a haunted barn in Ohio that is believed to have been the scene of the grisly murders of an entire family. There was a wealthy farmer who owned a lot of land in Ohio. He built a new barn on his property every time his wife had a baby. He named the barns after each of his children, and by the time this story takes place, they had 6 kids and were expecting number 7. However, the farmer's wife died in childbirth, and so did the unborn baby. The farmer went insane with grief and couldn't tend to his farm. The family had no money, and the farm started going under. They say that one night, in the depths of his madness and despair, the farmer took an axe and led his children out to the barns where he murdered them, one by one. He buried each of their bodies in the 6 barns that had been named after them. Then, the farmer went to the 7th barn where he hung himself. As the story goes, all of the barns were eventually torn down and the land was sold off, all except for the 7th barn. Nobody wanted to buy the land because of what had happened there, so it was abandoned and soon fell into disrepair. They say if you go to that barn at night, you can see the ghost of the farmer hanging from the rafters, his body swinging back and forth in the wind, dwelling on his terrible crime for all eternity. No one was ever really sure where the 7th barn was located, although it was definitely in Ohio, and others said it was the top of the world in Northampton. In 1997, a local Ohio teacher claimed that, after a lot of research, he had finally managed to track down the real location of the infamous 7th barn. According to the teacher, he was able to pinpoint the current locations because of all the barns on neighboring properties had nameplates above their doors with the names of the children engraved on them. The teacher and his son set out at night to visit the barn, bringing a video camera with them, in hopes of capturing some supernatural activity. The next morning, the teacher's wife reported her husband and son missing. Police found their abandoned car by the roadside. While searching the area, they entered a barn in a nearby field and found the dead bodies of the teacher and his son hanging from the rafters. See, that's where I've never really understood some of these quote-unquote ghost stories. Now, in my experience, of course, we can't prove ghosts exist, right? I've never seen a ghost physically harm somebody or heard of such a thing. Demonic spirits, perhaps, but ghosts are basically just supposed to scare the shit out of you. They're supposed to be there 1 second, you're not expecting it, and bam, it hits you like a ton of bricks. But, these stories are pretty far-fetched. A ghost made them hang themselves from the rafters, so I don't know. It's an urban legend. Let's see if we can't find a fourth. Perfect Girl, author unknown. One summer, a girl moved into the house next door. She lived with her mother, and they were quite poor. Her father had abandoned them years before. She was new in town and found it hard to adjust. Although we both came from different backgrounds, she and I got to be friends. We were not very close friends, but I often visited her house and we would talk. The moment I laid eyes on her, I knew she was the perfect girl for me. Unfortunately, she didn't feel the same way. She was attracted to boys who were handsome and confident. It was clear that I wasn't that type, so I decided to wait. She didn't have any friends of her own to talk to, so she confided in me. Mostly, she would complain about her life, telling me how her mother hit her, how the other girls in her class were mean and excluded her. She also told me about a boy she had a crush on. He was very popular with the girls in school. As she talked about her problems, I just sat there and listened. One day, the girl stopped coming to school. As it turned out, it was because she was being bullied. She told me that one of the popular girls in school had found out she had a crush on her boyfriend. The popular girl and her friends would bully her every time they saw her. She said that they would spread vile rumors about her to the other classmates and that they were making her life a living nightmare. I just kept quiet and listened as she vented her problems. Her behavior began to change after she entered junior high school. She stayed out until all hours of the night and began to smoke cigarettes and drink alcohol. I heard rumors that she was doing drugs too. She fell in with a bad crowd and was even arrested by the police once. Her home life grew even worse and she would frequently quarrel with her mother in the middle of the night. All of the other girls in school hated her. Someone sprayed graffiti all over her house, calling her horrible names and saying disgusting things about her. Someone even killed her pet cat and stuffed it through her mailbox. Eventually, the girl dropped out of high school. She became withdrawn and locked herself in her bedroom. She stopped speaking to her mother and went for days without leaving her room. She rarely even came out to eat. She looked pale, sickly, and painfully thin. Her mother took to leaving food outside her door. She would only come out when she needed to use the toilet or in the middle of the night when her mother was asleep. It was a miserable life. I went to see her for the first time in a long time. She refused to come out to see me, and even though I yelled through the keyhole, she refused to answer. Her mother gave me a bowl of soup to take upstairs to her. I caught a glimpse of her when she opened the door to take it. She was pale and sickly looking. She looked like a wet rag that had been wrung out. I went to see her every day. After a while, the girl began talking to me again through the door. She told me how she was constantly fighting with her mother and all of her old friends had forgotten about her. She told me how she had fallen in a bad crowd and went out with them at night, stealing, doing drugs, and getting into trouble. She told me she was caught shoplifting by the police and had a criminal record. She told me how her mother tried to help her at first, but when she wouldn't listen, her mother flew into a rage and beat her. Her life had become unbearable. She wanted to die, and she told me that she tried to commit suicide many times by slitting her wrists. Just like the old days, she continued to talk on, and I just listened. Whenever she asked for my opinion, I just shrugged. As time went by, her mood began to gradually brighten. She even decided to come out of her room. It seemed like things were getting better and the future was looking positive. Her mother broke down in tears and thanked me. One day, the girl went up to the roof of an apartment building in the neighborhood and jumped off. The building wasn't very high and she landed in the shrubbery. That was probably what saved her life. However, her spinal cord was injured in the fall and she was paralyzed from the neck down. The doctor said she would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. When she got out of the hospital, I went to see her. She was lying in her bed, unable to move. She apologized to me over and over and she couldn't stop crying. She said she wished she didn't survive the fall and told me she was sorry for all the trouble she had caused me and her mother. I tried to soothe her and stop her crying, but it's hard to comfort someone when they are lying down. I embraced her awkwardly. She was weeping so much that her whole body was shaking. She couldn't even wipe away her own tears. As I held her in her arms, I asked her to marry me. She was like, "Really? Are you serious? Me? Really?" She couldn't believe that anyone would want her. I had to propose to her several times before she would believe I really meant it. She cried so hard, her tears ran dry. I tried to reassure her and told her I wanted to marry her because I had always loved her. She was the perfect girl for me. She always had been. Even when she ignored me and didn't return my feelings. Even when she was hanging out with a bad crowd. Even when I had to listen to all her stupid problems. Even when she became so thin and was hiding in her room. Even when I told the popular girl she fancied her boyfriend. Even when I was spreading vile rumors about her to her classmates. Even when I sprayed graffiti all over her house. Even when I killed her cat and put it through the letterbox of her house. Even now that she is lying there in her bed, small, weak, and unable to move, even now I still love her. You see, she is the perfect girl for me. Soon we will be married. So she puts him in the friend zone, and he pretends to listen to her even though he's being selfish. And it's one thing to listen to a girl and have her convey her problems and just listen. And it's also another thing to never offer advice and just be a complete mute. So what does he do? She doesn't like him. He goes and makes her life a living hell. He deserves a pumpkin upside the head, as hard as I can possibly throw it. Hey, that's it for tonight, y'all. We're going to come back tomorrow with just a few more nights of Halloween left with some more stories. So hope everybody enjoyed the content. Have a good night. We'll see you soon.